Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 55th ever Highlight Haven interview. My name is Matthew Heiserman, and today we are joined by college football journalist Chris Vannini. Chris, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, good to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, really appreciate it. Let's get right into it. I just want to start by asking when you first knew that you wanted to work in the sports industry.
Well, sports pretty much forever. I grew up playing hockey, running track. I always kind of wanted to be in sports. I just didn't totally know how.
Mhm.
And even when I was applying to colleges, I didn't totally know what I wanted to do. Sports business, sports marketing, like kinesiology, maybe something like that. And I thought back to in high school, I had spent a year on the high school newspaper. Didn't do a ton, didn't do very much, but I was like, you know what? I like writing. I knew I liked writing.
Mhm.
And so I was like, okay, what about sports writing? I just kind of never put the two together. I've always loved writing. I mean, back in fifth grade, we got assigned a 5 page short story to write whatever you want. And I wrote like 20 pages and I asked my teacher if I could keep doing it. And then I just did it on my own and it got to like 100 pages or something like that. So I've always liked the writing
Mhm.
aspect. And so, not really until going to college did I put together like, hey, sports writing. Maybe that's the thing to do. And I went to Michigan State, where they have a very good journalism program and a good student newspaper, which I honestly didn't even know until I got there. And that's
Mhm.
where things kind of got started.
Now, getting into some college football topics, recently we've seen a lot of ex NFL players taking coaching jobs at the college level, including Eddie George, Deshaun Jackson, Clinton Portis, Marshall Falk, Warren Sapp, obviously, also Deion Sanders, head coach at Colorado. What's your thoughts on former players becoming coaches, and do you think that they bring a different perspective or a different aspect to the table than a typical college coach who might not have that NFL experience?
It depends. Being a coach
Mhm.
is a whole lot of work, and nobody ever gets into it for the money. Like even Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, Dabo Sweeney, what have you. They all start at the very, very bottom,
Yeah.
making nothing, just because they wanted to be around football. They finished playing whenever that was. Maybe they played college, maybe they didn't. Maybe they played a little in the NFL, but they want to stay in football. And coaching is where a lot of them end up. Their former coach brings them onto a staff or something like that. And so they eventually work their way up. They grind, you do all the jobs that nobody wants to do. And eventually you get better, you get lucky, you get a break, and you end up a head coach somewhere. So the NFL players coming in down to be head coaches directly is a different path and one that doesn't always work. I
Yeah.
will say, to the Deion Sanders point, a lot of people didn't give him credit for being a coach long before then. He was an assistant coach at Trinity Christian here in Dallas for Shador's team. He was the offensive coordinator. Like he was doing the grind a bit, so to speak,
Yeah.
before. And then he goes to Jackson State, where you don't have a lot of resources there. You got to grind to get there. Eddie George going to Tennessee State, you've got to grind and get through that type of stuff. And that's not for everybody. Ed Reed got the job at Bethune Cookman, got down there in Florida and quickly realized I don't have the resources I'm used to. Started criticizing the school. They end up parting ways after a couple of weeks. They never even really completed the deal. So the NFL guys, some of these guys are used to the best stuff. And the ones who have the success realize where they're at on the totem pole and they need to start working. It's not like basketball. It's not basketball where you can come, you can be JJ Redick and just go from ESPN to coach the Lakers and it works because your players kind of figure things out. Coaching is way more important and way more detailed in football. It's much more of a grind. And so that's what the successful ones know to do.
Yeah, now not necessarily a coach in this situation, but a GM. Yesterday, Stanford GM Andrew Luck fired head coach Troy Taylor following some bullying investigations. Who do you expect to step in as the new head coach for Stanford football in 2025?
Well, it's hard to say because it's late March.
Mhm.
This isn't the normal coaching carousel
Yeah.
where you find somebody and it makes it easy for them to move. It's possible, and Andrew Luck said this, they may just promote somebody from within and be the acting head coach for 2025. I think if that happens, Tavita Pritchard on staff might be the guy if they do that. But there are some other potential names. Jason Garrett, the NBC analyst who's the
Yeah.
former Cowboys head coach, he was a finalist for the Stanford job the last time it opened, didn't get the job. He's not coaching right now. So like he is someone who could come in. We've seen these situations before. You know, when Art Briles got fired at Baylor in the middle of the offseason, they brought in Jim Grobe to kind of just be the acting head
Mhm.
coach for the year and keep everybody there. So it's going to come down to, if you're Andrew Luck, can you find a good enough coach who you would hire in December and hire him now and bring their whole staff and everything? And if you can't, maybe you just find somebody who can be just the acting head coach for the season and let that play out. I think Troy Walters, assistant coach with the Bengals. I think he's a Stanford alum or used to coach
Yeah.
there. Maybe that's another possibility. But March is not the time you want to be making a coaching search, and that's why it's a very difficult position.
Now, staying with the coaching, on March 13th, you came out with an article where you ranked the top 20 best head coaches in all of college football's group of five. In that article, your number one coach was Jamie Chadwell of Liberty. Can you just elaborate on what makes him such a good coach in your mind?
Yeah, he's a guy who really worked his from the bottom all the way up. He's coached
Mhm.
at
Yeah.
Division II and FCS, and now he goes to Coastal Carolina and then Liberty. And he had an undefeated regular season there at Coastal Carolina in 2020, which was a very fun team. They only lost like 3 or 4 games his last couple of years there. He goes to Liberty, and then in 2023 they have an undefeated regular season. They
Yeah.
they reached the Fiesta Bowl where they play Oregon. They got blown out in that game, but they were obviously not as good of a team. But he has always had a creative offense and done it in a way where you can put up a lot of points and have a lot of fun. And he's at a place like Liberty that has a lot of resources where he can be a little bit choosy with his next job. He doesn't need to take a low level SEC job, so to speak. He can wait till he finds the right job to come along. Because when he was at Coastal and he was winning big, he was like the lowest paid coach in the country, I think, at that
Yeah.
point. So that's when you're kind of looking like, me, I got to get out while I can, find the better job. Liberty, he might stick around for a longer period of time.
Yeah, now I know you were talking about this a little bit on your X account. This year, we've obviously seen much less upsets in March Madness than we typically do. And on First Take, Stephen A. Smith was talking about this topic. He stated, if this continues, it will be the death of college basketball. How much truth do you think there is to that opinion?
I think death is probably a strong word,
Mhm.
but I do think it's notable that it kind of was the biggest story coming out of the first weekend, that there isn't
Yeah.
any of those. And is that going to be a trend? I don't know if it's going to be a trend. I mean, 2 years ago, we had FAU and San Diego State in the Final Four. Last year, we had Yale beat Auburn and
Mhm.
Oakland beat Kentucky. So, like, we need more time and more data before we know if it's a trend or not. But I do think it ultimately will not be good if the Cinderellas don't happen or potentially aren't involved in the future of college sports or whatever it is. The allure of the NCAA tournament is that it's all these schools you've never heard of beating the big schools. And people generally want that in the first weekend. Now, when you get into the second weekend in the Final Four, maybe the TV ratings have shown out. Butler and VCU and George Mason, they're not great for television. There's
Mhm.
not as much of a pull there at the end of the tournament. But at the beginning, you want a couple of schools that everybody kind of puts their arms around. Your St. Peter's, your
Mhm. Yeah.
UMBCs, your Fairleigh Dickinsons, like just for like a weekend or
Mhm.
two,
Yeah.
people like that. And I do think it's important that that does go away, because if it's just a power conference tournament and all these teams that already play each other are playing each other again, you kind of lose that allure.
Now, is there a reason why you think there's been less upsets? Maybe those other teams have less NIL money, less resources, worse recruiting just because of the status of the school?
I do think, I mean, you can't say it's not part of it.
Mhm.
That FAU team that went to the Final Four, I think 3 starters from that team are currently on other teams that are now in the
Yeah.
Sweet 16.
Mhm.
Janelle Davis is at Arkansas.
Mhm.
One of the guys is at Michigan. So if FAU had been able to keep those players, they probably be better. So that definitely is part of it. You know, if you're a mid-major player and you have a big year, you're going to have an offer to go somewhere else. So the mid majors that thrive are going to have to be the ones that know they can pull guys down. You can find guys from power schools who aren't playing, who maybe they want playing time. You bring them down to your level. You can't pay them or pay them very much, but they want to play. And you got to find those guys and kind of use the portal to your own advantage in a different way, because you're not going to be able to outspend certain people. You're going to have to create a place that people still want to be at.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And recently with The Athletic, you had an article where you ranked the most overplayed March Madness commercials of all time from best to worst. This obviously isn't the typical kind of coverage you do. So I want to ask, what made you decide to dive into this topic?
I was driving home during the weekend of conference championship games. I was just on the road,
Mhm.
and I think some commercial played, and it reminded me of some old March Madness commercial. And I was like,
Mhm.
you know, it'd be fun to kind of rank the old commercials, because every year, every other year, there's one that just annoys you to no end, and you hear a million times. And I was like, I feel like everybody can relate to that. And we at the Athletic, we've done some stories like reviewing the Super Bowl commercials, or the NHL writers might write about the overplayed NHL commercials. And so I thought this would be a fun, nostalgic way to look back at things that a lot of people remember. I feel old that some of those commercials were probably older than you at this point, but there are certain commercials from 10 years ago. Napa Know How from 2011. That was like the first one that kind of got overplayed, and it's got like a country song to it, and it's been 14 years since then, and I still think about that commercial, and I can find it on YouTube. And so that was kind of fun to go back to that. And a lot of people who are like, "Oh man, I totally forgot about this commercial, but I used to hear it all the time." And so it's just another way for people to connect to sports that's not just, what happened in front of you. Like we all have multifaceted relationships with sports. It's not just about win or lose. It's what's the broadcast like? Did the announcer say something? Was there a commercial that everybody got annoyed with? Do I have to pay to watch the game? So there's so many different ways to write about sports. That's not just what happens on the field, because it's an entire, obviously, $1 trillion business.
Yeah, I love to hear that, and we kinda touched on this earlier when we were talking about how there have been less upsets, but there's no doubt that smaller schools are heavily affected by the transfer portal. We see a lot of breakout players from those small schools end up transferring to bigger schools. Do you think that this, in any way, sort of punishes small schools for having better recruiting or being able to find the hidden gems that eventually get taken away from them?
Yeah, I mean, it very clearly does. I mean, New Mexico, um, over the last 4 months, they have lost their football coach and their basketball
Yeah.
coach, their best like 10 football players, their best two basketball players. That
Mhm.
football team went 5-7, by the way. It wasn't even like an
Mhm.
amazing
Yeah.
team, but
Mhm.
they were doing something pretty good, and everybody wanted a piece of it. And so it is difficult for schools, and it's really difficult for fans to kind of wrap your arms around it when you know, oh, this guy's good, he's going to be gone in a year. And that's a long-term issue college sports needs to figure out. However, if you're the player and you've brought all this value to a school for whatever reason, you deserve some of that money. That is what NIL partly is. It's what the revenue sharing is. For a lot of these players, they aren't going to go pro in sports. This might be the most famous period of their lives, the most valuable couple of years of their lives, and they should be able to make money off of that. And college sports forever refused to let it happen, and eventually the dam broke, and now they kind of can't control anything. And that's the world we live in. So it is a very difficult thing to balance, where you want the long term of college sports to remain healthy,
Yeah.
but the players got to get a piece of that pie too. And for way, way too long, they did not.
Now, I think we can all agree that there's obviously some teams in college football that just seem to thrive every year. The Michigans, Ohio States, Georgia, Alabama. Are you at all concerned about the parity in college football? And I'm not just talking about the smaller G5 schools being able to make the college football playoffs, but even some bigger schools. I'm from Maryland. A team like Maryland University, this is a big school. Are they ever going to be able to be in the same space that we see teams like Alabama if they aren't necessarily getting the same recruiting that those big schools have?
What's interesting is I do think NIL and the portal have actually brought more parity to college football because previously Alabama could sign all the 5 stars, you stash them on your bench for 2 or 3 years before they're ready to play, and then they play. Now those guys can move if they don't like where they're going,
Yeah.
or someone can pay more than Alabama offers and gets them. We saw the number one quarterback recruit, Dylan Raiola, go to Nebraska. I think you look at the top 10, top 20 recruits, they're going to more schools now. So that actually has leveled the playing field a bit at the highest levels. Now, like you said, it's still rough for the group of 5. You're in New Mexico. You're probably worse off now than you were before. But I think we've had 7 different teams reach the Final Four the last 2 years.
Mhm.
The only one to go twice was Texas. After all those years of Alabama and dominating the championships, we've had Ohio State win, Michigan win, Georgia win. Georgia had won 2 in a row before then. So we're starting to see new teams reach the playoff and go farther. And that's where the 12-team playoff, the expanded playoff, helped as well. You know, and Arizona State wouldn't have been
Yeah.
there, and SMU wouldn't have been there, Boise State. And so you are getting a bit more parity, at least, among that top 50 among college football. If you're outside of that, you're still in a pretty tough spot. But I do think it has changed. It has changed things in unexpected ways than people thought.
Yeah, and this past season, we saw Marshall opt out of the 2024 Independence Bowl against Army due to various players entering the transfer portal. They also lost their head coach. I believe Louisiana Tech ended up taking their spot in that game. And Marshall ended up getting fined $100,000 by the Sun Belt for this decision. Do you think we could see more teams opt out of bowl games, or was this just a random anomaly?
Well, it was a little bit weird because Marshall won the Sun Belt,
Yeah, yeah,
but didn't come to an agreement to keep their coach.
yeah.
And the coach, Charles Huff, went to Southern Miss, which is also in the Sun Belt. It was near the bottom of the Sun Belt.
Yeah.
And so he left, and a lot of the good players left too, and some of them went with him. So that was a bit of a unique spot, but we do have a lot of teams have interim head coaches in the portal and not have a lot of players. It had never gotten to the point where a team just opted not to go. I think that was a line that nobody wanted to cross. But we had LSU, I want to say a couple years ago, LSU played a Texas Bowl with 40 to 50 players, like not that many guys,
Yeah.
and didn't go well, but they got through it. And so that is kind of, you think you're going to see, if they change the transfer portal window, which the coaches want to change the portal window to early January. That way, players don't have to leave in December and kind of messes up the postseason and all that stuff. So TBD on if that's going to happen, but it is a growing concern for sure.
Yeah, and you just mentioned this name, SMU. Last year, they played their first season in the ACC, finishing with an 11-3 record, and earned their first ever college football playoff berth in program history. Are there any under the radar teams entering 2025 that you think could be the next SMU, be the next Boise State, a team that could potentially make the college football playoffs this year?
I think BYU could be an interesting team,
Mm.
kind of in that Arizona State mold. Now, obviously,
Yeah.
BYU was pretty good last year, but they bring pretty much everybody back from what was a really good team. They'll be interesting. I think Utah could be interesting. They brought in New Mexico's offensive coordinator and quarterback to fix that side of the ball.
Mhm.
At the group of 5 level, I think Boise State could again be right there. They
Yeah.
lost Ashton Genty, in his record-breaking season, but they bring pretty much everybody else back, and they have a lot of really good running backs still. So I think Boise's probably still going to be my group of 5 favorite at this point.
And I'm asking this pretty much just from a fan perspective as a JMU fan, someone who writes about JMU. Where do you think they rank in terms of the group of 5 schools where they could potentially get into the tournament or just another good season, maybe a bowl game berth?
Yeah, I mean, they could obviously, you have the coaching change and you lose so many players to the portal to Indiana, they still had a really good season.
Yeah.
JMU is a place that has won pretty much forever. Like they always win there. They move up from FCS to FBS and they keep winning. So I would imagine JMU is again going to be one of the favorites to win the Sun Belt. And if you win the Sun Belt, you're in that conversation because
Yeah.
it's the highest ranked champion. The people who get the bids at least for next year. So yeah, JMU is going to be on that short list probably of teams I think could make a playoff run out of the group of 5.
And I think a lot of it depends on how they play in their biggest games of the season. They obviously play against Louisville, they play against Washington State, and I believe they play against Liberty. So I think it just depends on how they play against that good competition. Can they compete at the college football playoff level? And we'll just have to see, obviously. And last week, it was announced that EA Sports will be raising their payments to $1,500 for players appearing in College Football 26. I know you wrote an article about this as well. What's your thoughts on having a video game affect the NIL and what we've seen out of the College Football 26, College Football 25 series?
Well, it's funny because the video game is kind of what brought NIL to the forefront in
Mhm.
the first
Yeah.
place, 12, 13 years ago, because Ed O'Bannon, a former player, was in the video game and not getting paid for it. And everybody knew who all these players were in the game. They had the same jersey number, the same look, the same hometown. They just didn't have a name. And so that's where it kind of started to build up. Or wait a minute, players should probably be getting a slice of the revenue that they're bringing in, especially when it's very obviously how important they are. And so EA Sports had said, like, okay, we'll pay the players, like way back when. And the NCAA said no. So they canceled the game. But once NIL happens, now the game can come back because now they can pay players to be in the game. But how much do you pay them? There's 11,000 players,
Mhm.
scholarship players in FBS. How is that going to work? So ultimately, EA Sports decided in the first year to pay everybody $600 plus a copy of the game. There was some backlash to that, and other players got more money to promote the game. The guys who were on the cover got more money to be on the cover. But then the game goes on to be the highest selling sports video game of all time. And it becomes pretty clear like, okay, they probably need to pay the players a bit more. And so they do. Now there is an outside group called Pathway that is signing the NIL rights for video games for players to try to create an organization that can negotiate on behalf of the players to EA Sports, and they're offering upfront to get those rights $1,500. So EA Sports told me that they're raising from 600 to 1,500 was not a factor in the decision, but it's kind of hard to ignore it. You start building up some leverage, you start getting a bit more money. But again, 11,000 players, a lot of these people, it's the only NIL deal they're ever going to sign. And so a lot of players said last year they do it for free. Like everybody just wants to be in the video game.
Yeah.
And so finding that proper spot where they get what they're worth, but what does the market say? That's still what they're figuring out.
Now, besides the people, as you mentioned, who are advertising the game and are on the cover of the game, do you find it fair that all players are being paid the same? You have Arch Manning being paid the same as, let's say, the 100th best player in the game. Is that just something that they have to do to keep things equal for everyone?
It's part of it, but I also think you take out the top 50 players, you
Mhm.
still have 10,000, 950 players. You've got most of college football in
Yeah.
the game. Arch Manning, it did appear he got a separate deal
Mhm.
to be in the game because he didn't announce himself for the game until about the week before it came out. I do think some of the bigger, higher profile players may or may not be able to negotiate a higher fee
Mhm.
for themselves, but a lot of them are on the cover for this year, which has the leaked cover that came out
Yeah,
had
I saw that.
something like 10 to 15 players,
Mhm.
like 5 coaches, some former players. They'll all get paid for that. So a lot of those players who probably are worth a lot more are already going to get more for being on the cover. And ultimately, if you're a player, what do you get from being in the game versus not being in the game? Like there's not that much you do want to be in the game. It is advertising for yourself. It is promoting yourself. So figuring out what that right number is ultimately what it does. Because the NFL, it goes through the Players Association. You don't have individual players negotiating themselves into the game or not. And so that's where college football is not quite at, but would make it easier.
Yeah, now I want to highlight Michigan commit Bryce Underwood, who, according to both ESPN and 24/7 Sports, was the top-ranked player in the class of 2025. Do you see a world where Underwood starts for Michigan this upcoming season, or will he most likely sit behind Mikey Keene during his freshman campaign?
He could. I mean, just
Mhm,
depends how he looks in spring, depends how he looks in fall. I think, you go out and get Mikey Keene, the multi-year
mhm,
starter at Fresno State, as a veteran, a guy you can start the season with if Bryce
mhm,
Underwood's not the guy. And I'm sure Mikey Keene probably got a good amount of money to make that jump, even if it was to be a potential backup. But you got to let the competition play out the way it goes. And if he doesn't play the first year, it's not the end of the world. But Michigan went into last year with like no quarterbacks.
mhm,
They thought Alex Orji might be the guy. He very clearly was not the guy. And so now they're going in with potentially two
mhm.
guys who are worthy to start. So it's a much better position.
Now, I know this is a very broad question, but as college sports has continued to change over the years and will continue to change, what do you think the future looks like for both NIL and the transfer portal?
Well, in April, there will be a hearing for the House versus NCAA settlement, which could, if it gets approved, would lead to schools directly sharing revenue with players. And for a lot
Mm,
of schools, that just
mhm,
means bringing the NIL operations in house.
yeah,
We will now pay that out and make it more direct and maybe more clean. Now, there will still be NIL deals outside of that.
mhm,
If you're a big guy, you got a Nike deal or something like that. That still
yeah,
remains outside of it. But there will be a general cap of about $21 million that all the schools have agreed they will pay to their players. Probably like 15 of which is going to go to football.
mhm,
And so it's individual schools have to kind of figure out how they want to approach it and share that almost like a salary cap like pro sports. Um, as far as it comes to the portal and whatnot, a lot of these schools would like to sign these players
mhm,
to essentially multi-year NIL deals. A two
mhm,
or a 3-year contract instead of a 1-year contract, so you don't lose everybody every year. And so it's still kind of to be determined how legal that is, since they're not employees, and how
mhm,
that's all going to
yeah.
work. But the schools hope that this will create some more regulations to make things a little bit cleaner and will cut down on the player movement at least a bit. TBD on if it's going to work, but that is the hope.
Yeah, now I do have one final question to ask before we wrap things up. If there was one piece of advice you could give to an aspiring sports broadcaster or journalist like me, what would it be?
What I always tell young aspiring sports reporters is try to find something that nobody else is doing. It is very, very hard to stand out in today's media world, even more than ever. And if you're just doing the thing everybody else is doing, um, it's less likely to get noticed. We live in the attention economy. What are you doing to grab attention? I'm still trying to figure out what that means in 2025. Back in 2011, 2012, when I got out of college, I ended up at a website called coachingsearch.com. It's not really around anymore. But we did stories on coaching transactions, like up to the minute, and coaching philosophies. And nobody else was really doing that at the time. And so other media people would come to my site because it was the only place that they knew all that information was going to be. It was doing something that wasn't being done. Eventually, 5 years later, the Athletic hires me when the Athletic starts up. They hire me because Stuart Mandel was a fan of Coaching Search and what I did there. I get hired to the Athletic to write about the Group of Five. Well, nobody else nationally is really writing about the Group of Five. So there's a lot of stories here, again, that nobody else is really doing. And that have helped me advance within the company. So my advice is always like, try to find your niche or something different, something unique that people will come to you for. Because that is because you have to find ways to stand out because everybody's getting bombarded with everything all the time now, whether it's TikTok, writing, podcasting, whatever. Try to find something that's different and develop a community around that. People who trust you and come to you for this certain thing, and try to build it out from there, and hopefully someone likes you enough to kind of try to bring you in somewhere else.
Yeah, I really appreciate that advice, and I can't thank you enough for coming on. Is there anything else you want to say to the people watching before we wrap things up? Where can they find some of your work?
Yeah, all of my work is still on theathletic.com. We have a lot of college football and college basketball stuff going on right now for the NCAA tournament, and I'm at Chris Vannini on all of my social channels.
Again, big thanks to Chris Vannini for being the 55th ever Highlight Haven interview guest, and as always, we will see you next time.